Let's talk about managerial accounting basic costs. Costs are classified in different ways, and we have got to first of all figure out what is a cost, sometimes called a cost object. So what we're attaching the cost to. So that might be a product. If we make dog houses, a dog house could be called a cost object. Or it could be called a sales territory. So the eastern United States could be a sales territory, and that's our cost object that we're going to talk about. It could be a separate department or some activity. So costs that we pay for that are identified with those cost objects are either direct costs or indirect costs. The direct costs are if we can directly trace that cost to the cost object. So here they're saying the guitars that we make, our company makes, is a cost object. And if I can trace things to the guitar that I made, such as the Fender or various other pieces of the guitar, then those are direct costs of the guitar. If they're not traceable, like a foreman or people who fix the machines, they're not working on one exact guitar. So their work helps all the guitars. So it's not a traceable to one particular guitar, and therefore it's still a cost of making the guitars. We need maintenance people in the factory. We need foremen who are the supervisors. We need those. Those are costs, but they're not direct costs of a particular guitar. They're indirect costs. So again, the cost of any material that's an integral part of the final product is classified as a direct materials cost. The wages of each employee who is directly involved in converting materials into the final product are classified as direct labor costs. So the employee who is actually making the guitar, putting pieces together so that a guitar ends up being made, that's a direct labor cost, the cost of that employee's wages. Again, if you have an employee that just fixes the machines, or another employee that's a supervisor, employees that clean the floors, whatever, they are all a cost, and their cost has to be built into how much we charge the customer for that guitar. But they're not a direct labor cost. Only the guys who are actually building the guitars. The costs other than the direct materials and the direct labor costs that are part of the manufacturing process, they're costs that are in that factory building, they're all combined together and they're called factory overhead costs, manufacturing overhead, factory burden, or sometimes just simply overhead. And we will have an entire chapter dealing with overhead. These are some of the kinds of things that would be considered examples of overhead costs. So heating and lighting the factory building, repairing and maintaining factory equipment, property taxes such as real estate taxes that we have to pay on the building, insurance for the building, insurance for the equipment in the factory, depreciation of the factory plant and equipment. These are in addition to the indirect materials, which are the materials that go into the guitar, but they can't be traced to an exact guitar, such as maybe some glue or nails, things like that, that, you have a thing of glue and it's helping to make multiple guitars, or you have nails or whatever. So those are indirect materials. And indirect labor, as we said, were wages of those people who aren't actually making the guitars, but they're in the factory. So notice there's something here. All of the costs, these costs relate to the factory building. The factory building, or the people or parts that are inside the factory building. None of this deals with the people who work in the office, like the accounting people. Okay, so these are our three main costs that we have to deal with: direct materials, direct labor. Both of those can be traced to the exact each single guitar, and factory overhead, which are the indirect materials, indirect labors, plus a variety of other things that deal with the factory building. So those are the three costs that make up our inventory that we're making of guitars. Now, if we just take a look at the direct materials and direct labor together, those are prime costs. If we look at the direct labor and the factory overhead, those are the conversion costs. In other words, we've got the materials. How much does it cost us to convert those materials into finished products, such as guitars? Okay, so these are just vocabulary. Okay, so again, this is just another way to look at it. The prime costs showing you the direct materials, the lumber for the guitars, and the various other major pieces that can be traced to a particular guitar, and also the direct labor, the wages of the people who are actually making the guitar. Those are prime costs. The conversion costs are the direct labor plus the factory overhead, which is the indirect materials, indirect labor, plus everything to do with that factory building, not the office building. Product cost consists of those three elements: direct materials, direct labor, factory overhead. So this is just reiterating the same thing. The cost of the product, the guitar, is made up of the direct materials that went into the guitar, the direct labor of the wages of the people who built the guitar, plus the overhead, which includes a variety of things. Now, period, that was product cost. This is period cost. Period costs are costs that belong to a period. Like this month we had, which is a period, month is a period. This month we had these particular things. Period costs belong to the office building. Nothing about the factory building is part of period costs. Okay? So their period costs are usually generally classified into two categories. Selling expenses are those included in marketing and delivering the sold product to the customer. So any kind of delivery expense, any kind of marketing expense are selling expenses. And of course, the marketing people are part of the office. Okay? The other type of period cost is administrative expense. These are the costs incurred in administration of the business. These are also people in the office, and this would include the accounting department, accounts receivable, accounts payable, payroll, along with the upper management that is sitting in an office. So we divide period costs into selling expenses and administrative expenses in this form and fashion. Notice that no product costs are included. So wages of people who do accounting is called an administrative expense. Wages of people who do marketing and selling of guitars, that is called a selling expense. wages of the people who actually work in the factory making guitars is called direct labor and is part of the product cost. Wages of the supervisors out in the factory is called an indirect labor, and that's part of overhead, but still part of the product cost of the guitars. Okay, so here's just again some examples. The direct materials cost: wood, guitar strings, the guitar bridge. The direct labor cost is the people who's sawing and the people who are assembling the guitars. And the overhead includes electricity in the factory building, various other costs of the factory building, and plus the indirect materials and indirect labor. Whereas the period, or also known as non-manufacturing costs, are people in the office. The advertising, sales salaries, commissions, expenses of salespeople. Our selling expenses and the administrative expenses are the office salaries, office supplies, depreciation for the office building and the office equipment. All the same types of things that you already learned about in Accounting 101. Period expenses. Okay, here we're looking at, again, the product costs. If the product is not sold yet, then the costs of all the guitars that we made are going to go into an account called inventory, which is going to be on the balance sheet. We own that inventory, so it's an asset. The cost of all the guitars that actually got sold is a cost of goods sold. It goes into cost of goods sold, which is an expense account, and that gets subtracted from sales on the income statement to get gross profit. And we learned about that in Accounting 101 as well. Period costs are basic wages, expense and rent expense, etc. All those things that deal with the office building, which we've now divided into selling and administrative expenses. Those are expenses, and they'll be subtracted on the income statement as operating expenses below gross profit. Okay, materials inventory. We have 3 inventory accounts. We have materials inventory, sometimes called raw materials inventory. Consists of the cost of the direct and indirect materials that have not yet entered the manufacturing process. So when we first purchase the materials, whether they're direct or indirect, they go into the materials inventory account. Then when we use the materials, the direct materials go into work in process inventory, and the indirect costs will go into the overhead account. The finished goods inventory consists of the completed products that have not been sold. Okay, so work in process inventory includes the direct materials and the direct labors and some portion of the overhead costs for all the products that have not yet been completed. The finished goods inventory consists of the completed products, but they haven't been sold yet. So once we finish the guitars, they go to the distribution warehouse. Okay, here shows a balance sheet, and in merchandise inventory, this is a retail store that sells guitars that are already made, that they bought from the manufacturer. So there's only one merchandise inventory account. Here's Legend Guitars that actually makes guitars. They have 3 inventories: materials, work in process, and finished goods, like we just talked about. And that all those 3 together are included as inventory accounts on the balance sheet. Here, this shows the flow of the